Hi, everybody. Welcome back to Boomer Nation. I'm Kate Mullen. Thanks for joining us. I'm very excited about our guest today. Our guest is Professor Peter Austin, formerly a professor at St. Edward's University in Austin. He's got amazing credentials, and he's all about American and world history. There's so much we can talk about on this topic, but first I want to introduce you to Professor Peter Austin. Thank you for being here, Professor Austin.
Thank you, Kate, for having me. Delighted to be here. Good to meet you about a week ago.
Yeah, absolutely. I was fortunate enough that I met Professor Austin at a rally for Texas Republicans. It was a great place to be because it's democracy in action. Constitutions everywhere. I tried to give Professor Austin a constitution, and he's like, I've got stacks of them. And that's how our conversation began. Professor Austin, my cat.
You have a dynamic life, Kate. That's good.
So, Professor Austin, tell us a little bit about your background, and then I want to ask you about what you want to talk about, because you're way more informed than I am. So I don't even want to pretend to ask questions. But tell us a little bit first about your credentials and about where you are.
Oh gosh, I'm a historian. I'm an economic historian specifically, but I've touched many fields. Interestingly, I used to make my living as a pianist, so I'm interested in Mozart as much as Thomas Jefferson and Napoleon. I've headed two schools. I've headed a school in Austin, a K-12 private school, as well as a school up in New York City in Queens, in Kew Gardens. So I've touched education for the last 30 years or so. And for the last 15 or 16 years at St. Edward's, have had an opportunity to really to really teach everything from freshmen all the way up to seniors. I can't tell you which is my favorite. Freshmen have a charm all their own, having been just in high school just a few months before they meet me. And then all of a sudden, there's 4 years later, and it's seniors, and it's interesting to see how people change. So I'm interested currently in many things, but specifically to talk to you about the sort of intersection between education and politics, education and the political scene today, because it is profound. It's profound for going forward. It's profound today for elections. And that's why I'm so delighted to talk to you today.
Well, we're excited to have you here. And I don't think there's enough people in America that really understand or even begin to know about American history, because it seems like American history has sort of been phased out of our educational system. It's been a long time since I've been in there. But, and when I was in it, it was, it seemed like it was more the high points than anything else. But yeah, I think that I think you had mentioned that there is a history of education and politics and how they mix, as well as a history of politics and elections. And just talk to us a little bit about education and politics.
It's an exciting thing, and it's critical. It's exciting because you're dealing with students, 18 to 22, 23, 24. So they're interested in what you have to say, but in college it's kind of a peculiar experience in that the current state of education is that often, and there's a literature on this, that people come into college and they actually eager to learn, and they actually leave college more confused than when they entered. And it's a peculiar phenomenon, and it has to do with the professors that they come in contact with, the subjects that they come in contact with, and I'm very concerned about it. And I'm concerned with it to some extent with American history. When you mention American history, this idea of civics is interesting, because just talking about the branches of government, for example, the legislature, the presidency, the Supreme Court, we're seeing history actually take place, unfold right in front of us as far as this election is concerned. And by the way, we've talked off camera about this idea of contested elections. This isn't the first time that we've had a contested election in American history. In fact, The landslide is actually the exception to the rule. Close elections have been with us ever since, gosh, at least the early 1800s. So this isn't something that is new. It's something to embrace, and I think the American people can learn from. But this idea of civics is so important
And
because
what do you mean by civics?
what I mean by civics is this idea of how the government works, the relation of government to people, both most people think of Washington, D.C., but it's also local government and state government. And it's this idea of this magical formula that the founding fathers put together called the division of powers, the federalism or so on, and so on. And it's all encapsulated in the Constitution. This idea of federalism, of 50 different countries called states, hammered together, and is called a country called the United States of America. And each one of these states, and every one of these countries, if you will, is different. Each one of them is different. Nevada and Connecticut and Pennsylvania, and they all handle things differently. And this has to do with the balance of things happening in the United States. But this is the sort of thing that doesn't even get talked about in American colleges. We're not France, we're not Spain, we're not a unified political system like that, where everything would go, for example, through Paris or through Madrid. No, we have these decentralized way of doing things. So this idea,
Representative government.
all represented by people at the local level, and then local politics percolates up to the national level. And
do you feel that this chain of responsibility from the citizenry actually down to the leadership, do you feel that this has been abdicated? This knowledge of this chain of command has been abdicated by the younger generations, unlike our generation, or the baby boomers are the last ones to know American history or American civics?
I wouldn't say that. I mean, it's just the sort of the learned elites from Europe, for example, look down on the United States. They always have, as an unlearned people. We're too busy settling frontiers and farming and getting things done to know heady things like this. But no, it's just my point is that in colleges, in high schools, civics and the way government works is not considered. And even in law school, I actually met a woman last night at a function headed by Larry Arnn, who's president of Hillsdale College. And she said, my gosh, when I got to law school, it was amazing how many people had never read the Constitution before. This was the first time. This illustrated to me the deficit. And I say, well, why do you study physics, though? This is what's interesting, Kate. And I was thought about this in college particularly. Because the thing in colleges has become so bad is that if there's an underlying assumption in American history that the country is bad, it's founded on for fraudulent motives, it's racist, there's a whole list of slogans. So why study the way the country works if it's so bad? This isn't worthwhile. But it's very interesting because elections illustrate civics in action. But the idea of civics leads to the idea that history can be useful. I mean, to look back and see how these things are spinning out. And I'm reminded, history can be useful because when you were in history class, you didn't think of history as useful. You thought of it as a series of dates and things to get through and memorize. But I'm reminded of Mark Twain, the humorist, and he says, history doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes. And history doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes. It's idea of history isn't today is not unique. It's unique in the sense that the people who've lived here have never lived today has never lived before. That's unique. But there are very few things, very few challenges today where you can't find some time in the past where it was like that. So the history can provide a toolbox into solving problems today. That has to do with elections, it has to do with economics, it has to do with all kinds of things.
How can we apply history from the, how can we apply past history, which it might be redundant, to these elections today? What would be a similarity?
Well, you can look at how the machinery of government, how the courts have figured into a presidential election, how Congress has done this, and to learn the mistakes, learn the common practices, and learn the exceptions, and learn that if the Senate is acting in a certain way today, or the House with Nancy Pelosi, for example, you can say, my gosh, this is unusual compared to the founders or compared to the people who've done this. And why is this unusual? Is this unlawful, or is this irregular to the point of being unlawful?
Do
So
you
this is
feel like that the lack of civics or government education and involvement or understanding has to, because I agree with what you're saying about holding representatives accountable, in government accountable, and understanding the flow of how government works. But is it not also something that you left out is not technology? I mean, can we not learn from the past that, say, for instance, in person, individual voting, in a simple, almost, Blackstone, Whitestone kind of method, isn't that, wouldn't that be the answer to the problems that we've experienced, as we understand, with the Dominion voting machines and the Smartmatic technology software and all of that? I mean, is that the history lesson here?
uh, yes, I mean, the history of voting. I mean, my gosh, the history of the secret ballot is something something to be talked about. I mean, Kate, when you talk about Dominion software and maybe manipulation behind the scenes without even the voter knowing it, this is something that is that is new, and it's not new. Voting used to be by open outcry. You used to go to the public square, Kate, and say, I vote for so and so, or I vote for so and so. And I used to do the same thing. And it was considered a sort of a civic virtue, a democratic virtue to doing that. Then in the late 1800s, you had something called the secret ballot come in, where people didn't know who you were voting for. And that's probably pretty good, because you can't be influenced. People don't know exactly. There can't be really consequences for this. But so this technology you're talking about is actually just a hyper sort of. It's so secret that people don't know who you're voting for, and the person who votes doesn't even know that secretly that vote may be manipulated. So the history of voting is a fascinating one. And we may go to a more overt form after this Dominion thing spins out, depending on this idea of actually standing up and saying, "My gosh, I'm voting this way." But this idea of learning from history is an interesting thing, because one of the reasons why I think the elections have gone the way they have is because of COVID. And the sort of regulations that these ballots have been mailed out under the premise that people don't want to go out, they're too fearful, and so on. But what does history tell us about infectious disease? This isn't the first time we've talked about infectious disease. We've had at least 3 instances of the flu in the 20th century. 1918, terrible Spanish pandemic. 1957 or 1968, the Hong Kong flu. None of them, all of them were of equal severity, but did not result in collapsing an economy, shutting down an economy, controlling a population. This is very, very new. But without history, you don't know, you don't have this sort of perspective. History is very, very useful in also international affairs. China is connected to this COVID. Where did China come from? Where did this rising power? Has it always been a rising power? And where does President Trump fit in? The power of history to figure out, is he exceptional among the men who have sat in the White House, loosely speaking, since 1789, since George Washington? Where does he fit in? To have a longer view might if a longer view, you might have not on the people, our friends on the Democratic side, may not have such a hysterical view of Trump if they had some orientation. But without history, it's like not having a memory. I ask you. Go
Would
ahead.
would you say that well, at least let me say, to me it seems like every 75 years or so, someone comes along that is not a globalist, that someone comes along that is actually a patriot, someone that comes along that is almost ordained by God to lead this country forward into robust capitalism and freedom in a republic as opposed to a democracy or a oligarchy or anything like that. I mean, because I don't know who it would have been prior to Abraham Lincoln, or if there would have been someone prior to Abraham Lincoln. But there was Abraham Lincoln, that was assassinated. Possibly because of his involvement with the Fed, and certainly with wanting to mend the republic. There was John Kennedy that was assassinated with wanting to destroy the CIA and end the Fed. And even, was it Eisenhower, I think, that said that he was the one that coined the phrase military industrial complex.
Yes, in his farewell address to the nation.
So would you say that it's just a matter of globalists versus patriots?
That's so interesting. There always has been a balance like that. Globalist is a new term. It used to be called an internationalist. Woodrow Wilson was an internationalist. He wanted to involve the United States with World War I because one of his visions was the League of Nations, which is the predecessor of the United Nations, which really is multilateral global government. You're right. And Woodrow Wilson was about 100 years ago. I don't know about this cycles of history, Kate, this idea of every 75 years things happen. I'm not a student of that, but I know it's very popular to see it. I guess before Abraham Lincoln, you occasionally have those leaders that after which everything is different. Before Abraham Lincoln, of course, Andrew Jackson comes to mind, the man on the $20 bill, who's so controversial with our Indian tribes. There's just, I hear on Indian reservations, Andrew Jackson is such a villain they won't pick up a $20 bill. But these leaders sometimes emerge. I would put President Trump in that basket of influential leaders that disrupt the normal continuity of things. And this is not only exhilarating for part of the nation, but terrifying and a threat to another part of the nation. And that's part of what we see with this split. But if you have no sense of history, like if you lost your memory, like you couldn't remember where you lived or you'd be disoriented. Everything would seem new, shiny, special. So history is a great tonic into seeing what's really happening, what has happened in the past, what could happen in the future, and whether what we're talking about is unusual or not. This idea of knowing the past is so important too because of the rise of progressivism today.
Mm-hmm.
With
Let
people,
me ask you this: while you're talking about the rise of progressivism and
please.
the past, there was a meme I saw on social media that said something like, "Joseph McCarthy doesn't look so crazy now, does he?" Right? When we realize how many people in Hollywood actually are, communist, Marxist communist sympathizers, or certainly supporters, in that they throw money behind BLM, behind Antifa. We actually know what Joe Biden and Kamala Harris's end game is, and that's complete and utter succumb to socialism or eventually Marxist communism, because all socialism is communism light, right? So
Yes.
I wonder how many times in the past, besides the Red threat with Joseph McCarthy, how many other times in the past has there been a worry about communism or socialism creeping in and taking over America?
Well, the first time, of course, was right after gosh, that's the Kate. It's such a great question, because before you talk about communism, you have to ask her, where did this all begin? But it all began with the Bolshevik Revolution, the Russian Revolution that turned Russia into the Soviet Union. And this is the creation of this communist threat. So this happened in 1917 during World War I. At the same time, that big influenza pandemic was happening. And so the first Red Scare, you talked about.
Wait a second. You're saying
Please.
that the Bolshevik Revolution occurred at the same time that the Spanish flu was going on here? Was that the
Yeah,
one?
yeah, it was 1917 is the Russian Revolution, and 1918 is the influenza, and it's all under the umbrella of World War I. So under the confusion, under the fog of war, amazing things can happen. So this is a remarkable thing. And so the first Red Scare, China, communism, happened in the 1920s, just after the Bolshevik Revolution, when Stalin was coming.
I'm like blown away by what you just said. Look at the correlation between the Bolshevik Revolution, the pandemic of the Spanish flu, and the World War One. You know
Oh,
what,
it's
Peter?
fascinating.
That's what's happening right now. That's what's happening right now. A similar Bolshevik Revolution, a pandemic, and where they're calling this a digital world war.
You're illustrating the stacking of events, which if you have a little perspective on the past, you can handle this, you can recognize this, you can see it, as opposed to being surprised by things, as opposed to being blindsided. And if you can recognize these things, you can deal with it with a level head. And this is why I'm so thrilled to talk about this with you, because the secret to working at this with a level head is information, is education. And one of the things where the colleges have fallen down grievously is in the education of people to see these long-term trends, which if people had these at their disposal, they could vote more intelligently, they could be more stable, more level-headed, more
Anticipate. They would be able
and more powerful
to
in a democracy.
and they would be able to anticipate. They would be able to say, "Oh, interesting that we're having all these socialist leftists like Andrea Ocasio-Cortez and Ayanna Pressley elected to Congress." They'd be able to anticipate. Well, this looks like it's a problem forming. This looks like a little nugget of socialism happening. And if we look back at the Bolshevik Revolution, I would bet, and this is probably a whole nother show to talk about, is this slow encroachment of communism into the Bolshevik Republic.
Uh,
I mean,
yes, it's hard to say, but there's a theme here, is that the Bolsheviks under Vladimir Lenin, not John Lennon, which is the member of the Beatles, Vladimir Lenin, and he promised a bright future, a shining future, a utopia, a worker's paradise, a progressive viewpoint. And this is what we're seeing with those Ocasio-Cortez you mentioned. This is progressivism, this bright future, something we've never seen before, this workers, this empowerment. And this is interesting because progressivism and Bolshevism has always promised this bright future, but actually it's a rhetoric disguising a tyranny. And this is not progressivism, which I've talked to you about this. Progressivism appeals to young people because young people are very excited for the future, as they should be. They're looking forward. They're not looking past. That's why history is such a hard sell for young people, because they want to look forward, not back. So progressivism disguises itself as this advanced way of thinking, that if you're not progressive, you're somehow, regressive or looking in the past. But actually, progressivism is a very old, it's tyranny, it's kingship, it's an old form. The new form is actually what a conservative says, or what you stand for, which is freedom. Freedom is the advanced way of thinking, the exception to history. And yeah.
Let me ask you this real quick. Have we, in your estimation, in America, had a golden age of America yet? Or were there more than one?
It's hard to know. There, you mentioned the Fed back with Abraham Lincoln, which I wasn't sure what you were talking about, but the Fed, the Federal
Well,
Reserve.
what I was talking about was that I understand that there's a good possibility that Lincoln's desire to do something with the money system was in
Oh,
part what got him assassinated. It may
oh,
not have been
good.
the Federal Reserve again.
Yeah.
You know, I'm a talking head, right?
No,
However,
you're a good talking head because money was a big issue in the Civil War. We had to print a heck of a lot of it to win the war if you're on the Union side. And that had to do with greenbacks and so on. We didn't really have paper money before Lincoln. So this idea of paper money and so on. But the Fed, the reason why the golden age, there have been several golden ages in my view. One of them uh, came up to World War One, the whole 19th century, the 1800s, which was before the Fed. It was the highest period of economic growth we've ever had. We had no central reserve, central bank. We had no big money managers and so on. And this was a time when we settled the frontier. Freedom was alive and well. We've always had to worry about freedom because freedom is rare, exceptional, and fragile. But this was a time when people could muscularly exercise their freedom by settling new lands, by going out west, testing themselves. And this is a time that is so different from our own. But what a great show to consider when those golden ages were and how they came and went, and how people perceive them. That's a show for another day, but I'd be delighted to talk about it.
so do you see a golden age? Would you, in your estimation, say that a golden age is a time where there is
After
limited?
World War II, after World War II was a golden age as well.
Well, in the future, if we're creating a golden age, would you say that a golden age to qualify as a golden age, would you say that that would have to be something that would be um, limited or no financial oversight with regard to something like the Federal Reserve, so that it's directly treasury to person? There were a couple of things that you mentioned that were extant in the golden age that you were referring to when the country was founded. There was a freedom of exploration. There was no paper money. It was coin money, and I would assume coin money probably had its own intrinsic value as far as a precious metal. So
Very much so. Gold and silver were the standard. Each state had its own money for a while. This was a time when people regulated themselves much more than they do now. It was a self-governing people, and that goes even back to our presidency. That in the 19th century or up to about World War II, the president was considered someone who actually just carried out the will of Congress. Why? Let me remind you, you're a constitutional carrier. The first article of the Constitution was the duties of Congress. The Congress are those people representing the people most directly. The president's Article 2 just carries out the will of the people. And the president's become this sort of magisterial figure, this imperial figure. In the 19th century, after World War II, it was a small office, and it's become much larger, but the government has become much larger. And this might make my big fear. And let me loop back to a theme I'd like to hammer home, and I hope it makes sense. One of my great fears is the idea of this golden age, is the idea, this new element that I'm worried about, is the element of big tech. This idea of censorship without you even knowing it sometimes. And you have big tech seeming to have some sort of political motive, and it meets a generation of students, 2 or 3 generations of students that have come out that have been conditioned by the educational system. This is not my opinion. This is not a rumor. This is something I've lived with and people have talked about, who look for the federal government for answers. And they don't necessarily, they trust the government. So the government, see it proper to be controlled by the government. The students don't see anything wrong with being controlled. And so you have big tech controlling them in league with the government. And this is half the United States, or many students are actually in favor of abrogation, doing away with the First Amendment, for example.
Well, and what's interesting is that you
Hope
have
this makes sense. I'm talking about a lot of things with you. I'm thrilled to do it.
well, this is interesting because you have big tech influencing all these kids, which is big tech is essentially media all the way down the line. And
Interesting.
that's that's terrible. That's terrible because they have this overbearing ability to influence whatever's being seen, and it's sort of you can't be a good student if you don't have good resource materials, if you don't have good source materials. Uh,
Yes, I would agree.
and big tech limits access to source materials. Um, I think that without having educators that are passionate about what they do, like you are, without having live people that can directly influence it. But then again, I say that because you're an admirable man doing an admirable job. But you got to remember that who's the guy on that was part of the Weather Underground? Bernadette Dorn and Bill Ayers. Bill Ayers.
Blair.
Bill
Yeah.
Ayers was a terrorist, a domestic terrorist. He was all about killing cops and blowing stuff up. And now that man is a professor at an East Coast college. It's like,
Yes, and yes, he's from the 1960s, and you're quite right. And he authored a book that is one of the texts often used in education classes today. I've seen it.
yeah, and I'm sure that he's a big Saul Alinsky proponent. And it's like, how do we weed out these far left communists out of our education system so they're not influencing the kids that we love, that are going to inherit this country in a very short time?
Well, I hope that we revert to, I hope that what has characterized American history continues, which is this idea of decentralization. And you and I on the phone talked about so many options now that are coming up, options to a Google, options to this and that. And this idea of decentralization is so, and we talked about federalism. I mean, everything doesn't go through Washington. No, we have 50 states, so it's decentralized. And so, in the same way, the internet or newspapers or ways of getting out, this habit of decentralization is so important, of busting up monopolies, busting up an AT&T, not because AT&T is so it's anti-competitive. This is a habit of the United States. And one of the magic of American history is this idea to reform ourselves, to actually find solutions. And the Constitution is the oldest Constitution in the United States, and we have the ability to amend it. And I hope we amend it in a constructive way. But this idea of decentralization, of having options, of being pro-choice, if you will, people have choices, is almost in our genes. And I hope it's still in our DNA, Kate. This idea of freedom that is at the heart of the American spirit. And this idea of immigration, this idea of America not being a good country. Well, a lot of people in the world have not gotten that memo, because people are literally, they want to come to the country. They're dying to come to the country. And even a vivid example, a friend of mine pointed out to me the other day. He says, well, if the United States is such a racist country, why are applications from Black Africa going through the roof? They haven't gotten this memo. And so this idea of freedom, decentralization, could possibly save us, as it saved us so many times, and lead us into a new golden age. But while you're living through it, it can look awfully dark. But it takes patriots to stand up, look at the past, where have our solutions come from, and that's what inspires us going forward. So I'm inspired by the future, in the sense that big people like yourself look for a big cause, and the cause of liberty, I can't think of, is one of those big causes to which you can devote your life.
Absolutely. General Michael Flynn said that if America goes, the whole world goes. And that's a scary thought. So we've got a lot on our shoulders as far as knowing what our rights are as American citizens, getting your copy of the United States Constitution. And if you want a free pocket-sized copy, let me know and I'll mail you one, everybody. I know Peter doesn't need them. But know what your rights are, know what your obligations are as a person, as a citizen of this country, and ideally, what do you say, Peter? Know history. So, what is the phrase that them who are not familiar with history are condemned to repeat it, or something like that?
Yes.
We don't want to do that. Peter Austin, Professor Peter Austin, tell us how we can find out more about you, or tell us something that we can follow up on if we want to know more.
I have just actually have left St. Edward's, and because I think that I can make a better contribution outside of St. Edward's than within it.
Beautiful.
And I'm talking to a variety of organizations. I'm actually beginning my sort of avocation as a master teacher, gathering students in small groups. I'm also have a very exciting project trying to change opinions about the 1960s, which is talk about repeating history. So I'm excited going forward. Anybody who wants to contact me can get to me through my LinkedIn page at Peter Evans Austin at gmail.com or so. I'd be delighted to talk to you further about any of these issues. But I'm excited about this. But while you're going through these dark times, it can feel uncomfortable.
Well, I think that you're a bright light in a dark time, and just people understanding that we've been through this before and we've survived it. And the key, the remedy, is to be proactive, and to vote, and to be aware, and to do the research outside of Google. Get your source material from as many different places as you can, especially directly, like whitehouse.gov or the irs.gov or wherever. But don't just take our word for it. Do the research. Peter, would you like to say anything else before we go?
No, as a slogan of all my classes I ever taught was, don't believe anything I say, look into it for yourself. And that's the obligation of everyone within a vital democracy.
Beautiful. And that is a perfect way we're going to end it. Thank you, Dr. Peter Austin. This is Kate Mullen. You've been listening to Boomer Nation. We appreciate you. Stay tuned for more information and advertisements. Talk soon. Bye for now.